Some doors open slowly, not from hesitation, but because what stands behind them is worth the weight of every careful inch. We are about to hear this story right now. The candles in the great hall burned lower on the east side. They always did, something to do with the draught that crept beneath the enchanted ceiling every autumn, a cold breath the castle exhaled at the turn of the season. Hermione had learned to notice such things in her 2 years teaching here. Small constancies. The way the ceiling grayed before rain. The way the staircases groaned at precisely 11 minutes past midnight. The way first years, in their first week, always sat too close together at their house tables, shoulders touching, afraid that the person beside them might dissolve. She noticed the Malfoy boy because he did the opposite. He sat at the far end of the Slytherin table, separated from the nearest cluster of his yearmates by 3 deliberate seats. His plate was full. It had been full yesterday, and the day before that, the same untouched arrangement of roasted potatoes and braised lamb, as though the food were a stage set he was required to sit before, but not interact with. He was small for 11, pale in the way that spoke of a summer spent indoors, and he held his fork with the kind of mechanical precision that suggested someone had taught him table manners the way other children were taught spells, through repetition and consequence. Hermione watched him from the staff table with the particular attention she reserved for things she didn't yet understand. She had, in her first term, made the mistake of intervening too quickly. A Gryffindor boy who cried at breakfast, whom she'd approached with the full force of her concern, and who had promptly mortified himself in front of his entire house and not spoken to her for 6 weeks. She'd learned since then to wait, to observe, to let the shape of a problem become clear before she reached for a solution. But the Malfoy boy, Scorpius, she reminded herself, his name was Scorpius, had not eaten in 3 days. She set down her goblet. McGonagall, seated to her left, was deep in conversation with Flitwick about the scheduling of remedial charms. The rest of the staff table hummed with the low social noise of the end of a teaching day. Someone was passing the bread basket with a murmured thank you. Someone else was laughing at something she hadn't caught. The great hall smelled of rosemary and beeswax, and the particular dusty warmth that old stone exhales when it's been heated from within for 7 centuries. Hermione stood, straightened her robes out of habit rather than necessity, and walked the length of the staff table toward the stairs. She didn't sit beside him immediately. She came to the end of the Slytherin table and busied herself for a moment. Unnecessary, she knew, performative, with adjusting one of the candelabras that needed no adjusting. It bought her 3 seconds to let the boy grow aware of her presence without feeling ambushed. She'd learned that too. The approach mattered almost as much as what came after it. When she sat, she left 1 seat between them, close enough for conversation, far enough to feel like choice. "The lamb is better than it looks," she said, not to him precisely, more to the middle distance, the way she sometimes spoke when she was thinking aloud over a text. "Though I'll admit the rosemary is slightly heavy-handed this term. I think the house elves are overcorrecting after the feedback about last spring's herbs being too mild." Scorpius didn't respond, but his eyes, grey like his father's, though she hadn't yet made that comparison consciously, moved fractionally toward her, and then away. She took that as permission to continue. "I don't believe we've formally met," she said. "I'm Professor Granger. I teach potions. You won't have me until 3rd year, which is either good news or bad news, depending on how you feel about precise measurement and the smell of flobberworm mucus." A pause. The faintest alteration in the line of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of the muscular memory of one. "Scorpius Malfoy," he said. His voice was quiet, carefully modulated, older than his age. "I know." She poured herself a glass of water from the pitcher near the breadbasket, entirely as though this were her usual seat, as though she sat here every evening. "I know most of the first years by the 3rd week. Occupational hazard of caring too much about whether 11-year-olds are eating." The last words landed gently. She didn't look at him when she said them. That was the art of it, she'd discovered, the looking away that made honesty easier to receive. Scorpius looked down at his plate. His fork moved, a small mechanical drift, until its tine rested against a potato. He didn't eat it, but he didn't put the fork down either. "I'm not very hungry," he said. "That's all right," Hermione said. "You don't have to eat, but it is also all right if you'd like to." He looked at her then. A swift, assessing look, the kind she recognized from years of being the student who arrived already suspicious of any offered kindness, because experience had taught her that most people offered it with a condition attached. She met his gaze with nothing in it. No pity, no professional concern, just attention, steady and without agenda. Something in his small face rearranged itself into something a little less defended. He ate the potato. Hermione reached for the breadbasket, tore a small piece, and said nothing at all. She didn't know she was being watched. The great hall had 2 main entrances. The great double doors at the far end through which the students poured, and a smaller side door near the base of the staff table, used primarily by professors arriving late from the dungeons or the upper towers. It was through this side door that Draco Malfoy stepped at 17 minutes past 7, travel-worn, a briefcase in his left hand, and a letter in his right that had already been read twice on the train from London. He stopped. The scene before him was ordinary by any measurable standard. The hall was its usual early evening tumult, the percussion of cutlery, the layered murmur of 400 conversations, the warm amber light of 1,000 candles. But his gaze found his son with the same unerring gravity it always did, the same involuntary calibration, there, safe, present, and then registered a half-second later the woman sitting 2 seats away from him. He recognized her before he fully processed the fact that he was recognizing her. She was wearing academic robes in deep charcoal, her hair pulled back with the administrative severity of someone who had lectures in the morning and intentions of preparing for them tonight. She was not looking at Scorpius. She was looking at the bread in her hand with the expression of someone engaged in deeply private thought. But she was there, beside his son, in the space that had been empty for 3 days, according to the message from Scorpius's head of house that had prompted this unscheduled visit. And Scorpius was eating. Draco stood very still. He watched his son reach for the water pitcher and pour himself a glass with the particular focused care that meant he was trying to do something correctly. Watched Granger say something he couldn't hear from this distance. Watched the way Scorpius's shoulders, which had been drawn up toward his ears since September 1st, a posture Draco knew better than he knew his own hands, dropped approximately 2 centimeters. The letter in Draco's right hand crinkled slightly under the tightening of his grip. He had come prepared for a conversation with McGonagall. He had come prepared in the privacy of the train compartment for the particular kind of helplessness that visited him whenever the school owled to say that Scorpius was withdrawn, not engaging, concerning in ways we can't fully articulate. The helplessness that had no counterspell, that resisted every asset his family name, or his wealth, or his considerable capacity for controlled action could offer. He had come prepared for a lot of things. He had not come prepared for Hermione Granger to have already done something he couldn't. He didn't move toward them. The instinct to do so, to cross the hall, to sit with his son, to reclaim the moment, rose and stalled in the same breath. Scorpius was talking. Quietly, in the careful way he spoke when he was deciding whether to trust something, but talking nonetheless. And Granger was listening with her whole body angled slightly toward him, not performing attention, but actually paying it, the way she had apparently paid attention to everything since the age of 11, when she'd corrected his pronunciation on a moving staircase and changed the course of... Draco stopped that particular line of thought with the efficiency of long practice. He stepped back from the side door, not retreating, simply repositioning. He would see McGonagall first. He would not interrupt this. He was almost through the doorway when Scorpius laughed. It was a small sound, barely audible over the noise of the hall, but Draco heard it the way he heard everything that mattered, with his whole chest, with a sharp, involuntary expansion of breath that had nothing controlled about it. He turned back. Granger had said something. He would never know what. And his son had laughed, and was now applying himself to the lamb with the focused energy of someone who had, between one moment and the next, remembered that eating was something a person could choose to do. Draco stood in the doorway for 5 more seconds. Then he turned and walked toward McGonagall's office, briefcase in hand, the letter folded and pocketed, his face arranged into the composed neutrality that 11 years of Malfoy discipline had made nearly indistinguishable from calm. Nearly. He met with McGonagall for 40 minutes. She was, as always, precise, honest, and relentlessly kind in ways that managed not to feel condescending. A skill Draco had long since decided was either her greatest magic or her most exhausting one. She told him what the owls had told him, that Scorpius had been attending his classes, performing adequately, making no trouble and no friends, that he spoke when spoken to, that several professors had noted he was fine in the technical sense, while being evidently not fine in any human sense, a distinction she articulated without the phrase she was clearly avoiding. "He hasn't been eating," Draco said. "No," McGonagall confirmed, "though Professor Granger has apparently taken an interest." He kept his expression perfectly even. "I noticed. She has a gift for it." There was no particular emphasis in McGonagall's voice. The easy affection of a woman who had watched Hermione Granger grow up and seen the particular quality of her attention develop from anxious overachievement into something more like genuine vocation. She doesn't mother them. She simply makes them feel that someone specific has noticed them specifically. It's rather different from general care. Draco said nothing. His thumb moved once across the silver clasp of his briefcase. "Scorpius should stay," he said. "He's adjusting." "He is," McGonagall agreed. "Give him time and, I think, a consistent adult presence that isn't weighted with grief. He needs someone who knew him before the loss but isn't inside it." The words settled over the room with the quiet authority of things said plainly. Inside the grief. Yes, that was it, precisely. They were both inside it, he and Scorpius, both breathing the same airless air, and what his son needed was a window, and Draco could not be that because he was also the room. He stood to leave. At the door, he paused. "Professor Granger," he said, and heard the careful neutrality in his own voice, and despised it slightly. "She's been here 2 years?" 2.5, McGonagall said. "Is she effective? As a teacher?" McGonagall regarded him with the patience of someone who had been passing deflection since before he was born. "Extraordinarily," she said. "At teaching and at the other things." He nodded once, opened the door, closed it without sound behind him. The corridor outside McGonagall's office was empty at this hour, lit by a single torch that needed replacing and cast everything in amber shadow. Draco walked it slowly, one hand in his pocket, not in the direction of the main staircase, but toward the east wing, toward the great hall, though he wouldn't have said so. The hall was quieter now. The evening meal had largely concluded. The house tables were thinning as students drifted toward common rooms and staircases, their voices rising to the vaulted ceiling and dissolving. Draco stood at the side door again and found, with no surprise that he examined too closely, that the far end of the Slytherin table was empty. Scorpius had gone. The plate before his son's abandoned seat had been cleared. All the plates had been cleared. The candles were burning into their last third, the wax pooling in shallow silver dishes, and the hall smelled of extinguished flame and cold stone, the particular end-of-evening smell that castles gave off when they were settling themselves for the night. There was one person remaining at the Slytherin table. She was reading. Of course she was reading. She had produced a book from somewhere. His first irrational thought was that she'd had it on her person the entire meal, tucked into a robe pocket, waiting. And she was reading it with one elbow on the table and her chin resting on her hand, entirely unconscious of the abandoned grandeur of the empty hall around her, of the tapering candles and the still warm bread basket, and the enchanted ceiling deepening into full October night above her. She hadn't seen him. He could leave. He should leave. He had a room in the East Tower prepared by McGonagall's instruction, a small spare guest room that smelled of cedar and old wool. And he had an early meeting with Scorpius in the morning, and there was absolutely no productive reason to stand in a doorway staring at Hermione Granger, reading a book at the end of a house table that wasn't even her own. Her foot, he noticed, was tapping slowly under the table. Not a nervous rhythm, but a reading rhythm, the kind of involuntary physical punctuation he'd only ever seen in people who were genuinely inside a text. She turned a page. The book's spine caught the candlelight, something thin, dark-covered, not a text he recognized. He should leave. Instead, he found himself across the threshold before the decision had fully formed, his footfall quiet against the stone floor. And then he was standing at the other end of the table, not beside her, 3 seats away, some unconscious mirroring of the distance she'd chosen with Scorpius. And she looked up with the expression of someone interrupted mid-thought, slightly unfocused, faintly irritated, and then realigned. Her eyes found him. Something in her face, not surprise exactly, more the adjustment of someone filing a development into the correct category, went very still. "Malfoy," she said. "Granger." He set his briefcase down beside the bench and remained standing, because sitting implied a longer conversation than he was prepared to have. "You were sitting with my son." She closed the book without losing her place, a skill he noted distantly. "I was." "He ate?" "He did." A pause. She watched him with the particular quality of attention he'd clocked from across the hall, and that was, at close range, even more present. There was no easier word. "Is that a problem?" He had not meant it as a reproach. The fact that it had sounded like one told him something about the state of his own internal architecture that he didn't want to examine in a public room. "No," he said. His voice came out more deliberate than he'd intended. "No, it isn't a problem." She nodded slowly, set the book on the table beside her elbow, face up, as though she might return to it, but was willing to postpone the return. He could see now that it wasn't academic. It was poetry, an anthology, the kind of book that had no professional justification and therefore told him something unguarded. He looked at it a second too long. "He's very like you," Hermione said, in a tone that suggested the observation was neither judgment nor flattery, but simply a thing she had noticed. The way he sits, the way he decides whether to trust something. Draco's jaw tightened, the small involuntary drawing in that happened when something arrived too accurately. "That's not necessarily a recommendation." "I didn't say it was." Her chin lifted slightly, an old reflex, the familiar armature of the girl who had spent 6 years refusing to be talked down to. "I said it was similar." "I've never thought your way of sitting was a character flaw." The silence between them was thin and charged with something neither of them was naming. "He needs consistency," Draco said. The professional ground was safer. He moved toward it with the efficiency of someone who knew the terrain. There have been significant changes. He needs something stable." "I know," she said quietly. And then, more quietly still, "I'm not going anywhere." It was the simplest sentence. 4 words, a declaration of no particular consequence. The kind of reassurance a teacher gives a concerned parent in the ordinary course of pastoral care. It should not have done what it did. Draco picked up his briefcase. "Good night, Granger." "Good night." He walked toward the door. His footsteps echoed in the emptied hall, each one clean and final against the stone. Behind him, he heard the soft sound of a book being opened again. He did not look back, but his hand, closing around the door handle, held it for one breath longer than necessary, the cool iron pressing its edge into his palm, grounding him against something that had shifted in the last 20 minutes without his permission. Then he released it, and the door swung shut, and the hall was quiet. The owls came at breakfast. They always did. A reliable daily theatre, the sudden darkening of the enchanted ceiling as wings cut through the simulated sky, the percussion of talons on wood, the rustle and drop of letters and parcels distributed with the particular impartiality of creatures who cared nothing for the weight of what they carried. love letters and bill notices, and family photographs and report cards, all delivered with the same unhurried efficiency, all received with wildly different hearts. Hermione watched them from the staff table, the way she watched most things at breakfast, with one eye on the room and one on the parchment she was marking, a cup of tea growing cold at her elbow because she always forgot about it until it was too late. She wasn't watching for anything in particular. She noticed Scorpius receive his letter because she noticed everything about Scorpius now. The particular quality of her attention had locked onto him with the precision of a tracking charm she hadn't consciously cast. He was at the Slytherin table in his usual seat, which was no longer the most isolated position at the far end, but had migrated over the past 2 weeks to a spot approximately 4 places from the nearest cluster of his yearmates. Progress, she had noted privately, measured in the increments available to very careful children. The owl that found him was not a school owl. It was a small aristocratic creature, a Scops owl, tawny and precise, with the particular upright bearing of a bird that had been bred for aesthetics as much as function. It landed beside Scorpius's porridge with the controlled gravity of something that understood its own significance, extended its leg, and waited with evident impatience while Scorpius untied the letter. Hermione looked back at her marking. The essay in front of her was a 3rd year's analysis of the properties of Boomslang's skin. Competent, slightly over-reliant on the textbook, the kind of work produced by a student who understood the material well enough to reproduce it, and not yet well enough to argue with it. She made a note in the margin. Good technical recall. What do you think happens to the potency if the preparation temperature exceeds 37 degrees? Try the experiment. See what you find. She picked up her tea. Cold. She set it down. From the corner of her vision, she registered Scorpius reading his letter. He read it twice. She could tell by the rhythm of it, the slight pause and restart, the way his eyes tracked back to the top. Children who read letters twice were either checking for something they'd missed or memorizing something they were afraid to lose. She suspected, with the particular ache that had become familiar over the past fortnight, that it was the latter. She returned to the essay, made 3 more notes, reached for her tea again out of pure automatism, registered again that it was cold, and finally, with the decisive motion of someone resolving a small but persistent irritation, cast a silent califatio that restored it to the correct temperature. She was on the 4th essay when the letter arrived at her own elbow. Not from an owl. It had been slipped under the staff table's edge, delivered by a 2nd-year prefect who was already retreating before Hermione looked up. The note was from McGonagall. A room change for her afternoon office hours, 2 lines in the headmistress's precise hand, nothing requiring a response. Hermione folded it, reached for her stack of essays to align them before she placed the note on top. She knocked the stack sideways. Papers fanned across the table, and 2 slid off the edge entirely. She caught one, missed the other, and it drifted in the particular unhurried way of falling parchment to the floor beneath the staff table, where it came to rest against the leg of the bench 3 feet to her left. She retrieved it, and as she straightened, she registered on the stone floor beside the bench leg another piece of parchment, smaller, folded, unmistakably not one of hers. It must have fallen earlier, perhaps during the breakfast rush, perhaps carried on a draught from the hall's main doors. She picked it up with the reflex tidiness of someone who had spent her formative years returning things to their correct places. She meant to put it in the lost property box near the door. She meant to do that immediately. She unfolded it because the handwriting on the outside was familiar in a way that took her a moment to place. The contained vertical script she had seen on a planning document passed across the table at a Ministry Educational Committee meeting 2 years ago. A meeting she had attended as a newly appointed professor, and at which she had sat across from Draco Malfoy for 4 hours, without either of them acknowledging that they knew each other's handwriting from the opposing sides of a school rivalry. Scorpius, the outside read. She should have folded it back immediately. She read the first line before she understood what she was doing, and by the time she understood, the first line had already done its damage. I think about you every morning. First thing. Before the house is fully awake, before the owls have been let out, before anything has been required of the day. I think about whether you slept, and whether the dormitory is too cold, and whether the other boys have been decent to you. I think about whether you had breakfast. I know you haven't always. I don't say this to make you feel that you've failed at something. You haven't. Eating is one of those things that goes quiet in grief, like colour in winter. It comes back. It will come back for you. It came back for me, eventually, though it took longer than it should have, and I had less help than you do. Your head of house tells me you've been attending all your classes. That is more than I managed at your age under considerably less provocation, and I want you to know that I register it as the significant achievement it is. Hogwarts is yours now. I know it doesn't feel that way yet. It felt like someone else's place for a very long time when I was there. A place I was permitted to inhabit, not one that belonged to me. That changes. Not quickly, but it changes. There is a professor there. You may have met her by now, or you may not. Her name is Professor Granger. She teaches potions. She was someone I knew when I was at school, and we were not, at that time, kind to each other. That is a complicated history that I will explain when you are older, and when we are sitting somewhere with adequate tea and no time constraints. What I want to tell you now is that she is someone who pays attention to things that matter, and if she turns that attention toward you, you should let her. Whatever your instincts say about the name Malfoy and the people who carry it, she will not hold it against you. I'm reasonably certain of that. I am coming on the 14th. I will bring the good chess set. Father P.S. I have also sent biscuits. The tin is charmed to replenish every 3 days. Don't tell the other boys unless you want to be popular for the wrong reasons. Hermione sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The hall moved around her in its ordinary morning rhythm. The scrape of benches, the diminishing percussion of the owl post, the rising volume of students who had remembered they had lessons in 15 minutes and were reassessing their breakfast choices accordingly. The enchanted ceiling had shifted from the pale gold of early morning to the flat, honest grey of an October day that had decided on clouds and was committing to them. She was not reading it again. She was sitting with the particular stillness of someone who has been handed more information than they expected and is waiting for their internal architecture to accommodate it. She is someone who pays attention to things that matter. The sentence did something precise and uncomfortable to the space behind her sternum. Not because it was flattering, though it was in the contained, unsentimental way of a man who clearly did not deploy adjectives carelessly. Because it was accurate, and because accuracy from that specific source felt different from accuracy from any other. Because in 11 words, without apparent effort, Draco Malfoy had described the thing she had spent 2 years at Hogwarts trying to be and had never heard named back at her. She thought about the Great Hall 2 weeks ago, about the side door and the stillness she had felt from that direction, a stillness with a specific quality to it, the quality of held breath, the quality of observation that she had chosen at the time to attribute to a draft. Your instincts about the name Malfoy. She pressed the letter flat along its fold lines with her thumb. The parchment was good quality, heavy, cream, the kind of paper that had been in a family for generations and absorbed something of them. It smelled faintly of wood smoke and something cleaner underneath. Cedar, perhaps. Or the cold air of a house that had too many rooms for one man and one child, and let the autumn in through the edges. She thought about Scorpius reading this letter twice at breakfast. She understood now what he had been memorizing. The lost property box was 3 feet from the staff table door. She should deliver the letter there. Note to McGonagall where she'd found it. Let the administrative systems of the school return it to its owner. Scorpius, she knew, was now in his first lesson. Transfiguration, East Wing, 2nd floor. He would not know the letter was missing for hours. Draco Malfoy, she knew, was coming on the 14th. The 14th was tomorrow. She found Scorpius at lunch. He was eating, which she noted with the small, uncelebrated satisfaction of someone who has planted something and is watching it grow. He looked up when she approached, and the wariness that had been the primary expression of his face in their first week had become something more like recognition, a slight forward orientation of his whole posture. A door open to a specific width. "I believe this belongs to you," she said, and placed the letter on the table beside his pumpkin juice. He looked at it. Looked at her. His expression went through several calculations in rapid succession. "Did you—" "It fell in the Great Hall this morning. I found it." She kept her voice entirely even. "I didn't read it." The pause that followed was long enough to establish between 2 honest people that both of them understood the other perfectly. "Right," Scorpius said. "Your father is coming tomorrow." She pulled out the bench across from him and sat, not beside him this time, but facing him, which was its own kind of shift. "I thought you might want to know that I know that, so that if you wanted to talk about it, there wasn't anything to—" She looked for the right word and found one that was honest rather than clinical. "Arrange first." Scorpius looked at the letter. His fingers moved to the edge of it and stopped just short of touching it, the way children touched things that mattered too much for casual contact. "He worries," the boy said. It wasn't a complaint. It was the observation of someone who has learned to hold complex realities without resolving them prematurely. "He doesn't show it very well, but he worries." "I know," Hermione said. Scorpius looked up at her. "How do you know?" She was quiet for a moment. Outside the tall windows, the October sky had committed fully to its grey ambitions. A soft, total overcast that turned the lake to pewter and made the grounds look like an illustration in an old book, beautiful in a minor key. The kind of sky that pressed gently on everything beneath it. Because people who worry very much about something often become very controlled around that thing, she said. It's a way of managing it. If you hold everything very carefully, you can pretend you're not afraid of dropping it. Scorpius considered this with the grave, thorough attention he gave to things worth considering. She had noticed that about him early, the absence of the performative quickness that some clever children deployed to signal their intelligence. He didn't rush to the answer. He sat with the question until the answer came to him. "He's like that," Scorpius said. "About me." "I expect so," Hermione said. "Was he like that at school, when you knew him?" The question arrived without guile. The simple curiosity of an 11-year-old navigating the unfamiliar territory of a parent's past. Hermione looked at the boy across the table. The grey eyes, the careful posture, the slight forward lean of someone hungry for information they didn't know how to ask for directly. She thought about what honest looked like when the truth was complicated. "He was controlled at school," she said carefully. "He was a person under a great deal of pressure from many directions. I didn't understand that then. I think I understand it better now." "Did you like him?" "No," she said, because she owed him honesty. "Not then." Scorpius absorbed this. "Do you now?" The question was so direct, so unceremonious, so entirely the question of a child who had not yet learned to dress things in circumspection, that Hermione felt the breath move out of her before she could regulate it. She straightened her sleeve cuff, looked at the window, looked back at him. "I don't know him now," she said. "Not really." Scorpius looked at her with the expression of someone filing this answer under incomplete but not dishonest, which was, she suspected, a category his father had inadvertently taught him to recognize. "He said in his letter that you pay attention to things that matter," Scorpius said. He picked up his fork, turned it once in his hand. "That's true. You do." The warmth that moved through her chest at that was so uncomplicated, so purely itself, that she had no defensive response prepared for it. It simply arrived. "Eat your lunch," she said, because it was the only safe thing. He ate his lunch. And outside the pewter sky pressed gently on the castle, and the candles burned their ordinary amber. And somewhere in the train from London, she found herself thinking, with an internal precision she refused to examine too closely. A man was travelling north with a chess set and the unarticulated weight of everything he hadn't said. He arrived in the late afternoon. Hermione knew because the quality of the castle changed, a barely perceptible shift in atmospheric pressure, the way old stone registered the arrival of someone who had once belonged to it. She had felt it before with other alumni who visited, a kind of structural recognition, the castle acknowledging former inhabitants the way a body acknowledges scar tissue. Present, integrated, impossible to fully separate from the whole. She was in her classroom when it happened, preparing the ingredient stations for tomorrow's third-year lesson, measuring and decanting, the methodical work that required enough attention to occupy her hands and not enough to occupy her mind. The late light came through the dungeon windows at a low angle, turning the stone walls the colour of old honey, catching the glass of the potion bottles and refracting small rainbows across the ceiling with a quiet, indifferent beauty. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside and recognized them before she could have said how. Not Scorpius. Those were lighter, quicker, the footsteps of someone still growing into their own bones. Not a student at all. These were the footsteps of someone who had learned, somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, to move through spaces as though they had every right to them and no particular urgency about exercising it. She kept measuring. Flobberworm mucus, 14 milliliters, the syringe steady in her hand. The footsteps paused outside her door. A single knock. The door was already open. She kept it open during preparation, a habit she'd developed in her first term when the dungeon air grew too still and began to smell too insistently of old potions experiments. So the knock was a formality, a request rather than a necessity. She was already composing her expression by the time she looked up. Draco Malfoy stood in the doorway. He was wearing travelling clothes, a coat in dark charcoal wool, the collar turned up against the autumn cold he'd carried in from outside, a silver clasp at the throat that caught the low light. He looked more present than he had in the great hall 2 weeks ago, less like someone who had arrived and more like someone who had decided to arrive, the distinction being entirely internal but entirely visible to anyone paying the right kind of attention. He was carrying a leather satchel, the chess set, presumably. "Granger," he said. "Malfoy." She set down the syringe with the careful movement of someone managing a precise instrument. "Scorpius is in his common room. I can have someone fetch him, or you can go directly. The Slytherin entrance is—" "I know where it is," he said. A pause, and then something that acknowledged the unnecessary sharpness in his response. A fractional adjustment of his posture, not quite an apology, but occupying the same general territory. "I thought I'd find you first." She waited. He stepped into the room, not far, 2 paces, enough to clear the doorway, close enough that the conversation didn't have to travel across the dungeon's significant length. The low light caught the planes of his face with the same impartial honesty it brought to everything. The line between his brows that hadn't been there at school, the controlled set of his jaw, the particular quality of his eyes that she had been trying for the past 2 weeks not to find interesting. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for whatever you did. He's eating." "He was ready to eat," she said. "I just happened to be there." "Don't do that." The sharpness was back, and this time it was directed and precise. She felt it the way she felt a well-cast hex, a clean, sudden impact that demanded response. "Do what?" "Diminish it." His jaw shifted. "It matters. What you did matters, and I would prefer to thank you for it without you redirecting the credit to convenient timing." The sentence arrived with enough force that she needed a moment to absorb it. She looked at him across the dungeon, the potion stations between them, the amber light, the small rainbows still drifting across the ceiling from the glass bottles, the peculiar intimacy of a room prepared for work that hadn't happened yet. "All right," she said. "You're welcome." Something in his shoulders released by approximately the width of a breath. "He wrote me," Draco said. "First time he's written since term started. He said—" A pause, the specific pause of someone deciding how much of a private thing to transfer into speech. He said there was a professor who sat with him without asking him anything. "I asked him about the lamb." "The lamb," he repeated, with the tone of someone encountering information that is simultaneously trivial and significant. It seemed like a safe place to start. He was quiet for a moment. He set the leather satchel down against the nearest workstation with the careful movement of someone buying themselves a half-second of neutral activity. "Safe," he said. "Yes." There was something in the repetition, an echo, not of the word itself, but of its weight, the way a man repeats a word when it has landed somewhere personal. "He needs safe things right now," Hermione said. And because she was constitutionally incapable of circumlocution when a direct route existed, and the thing at the end of it mattered, she added, "They both do." "I expect." The silence that followed was different from the silences they'd built in the Great Hall 2 weeks ago. Those had been about distance, about managed space. This one was about something else. It had a different texture, denser, closer grained, the atmospheric pressure of two people who have just established, without quite agreeing to, that they are having a conversation rather than an exchange. Draco looked at her. Not the assessing look she'd catalogued before. Not calibration or threat calculation or any of the social tools she'd spent 6 years learning to decode. Just looking, the way people looked at things they were trying to understand. "McGonagall tells me you've been here 2 years," he said. 2.5. "Do you—" He stopped, revised. "Is it what you expected? Teaching?" The question surprised her into genuine consideration. She thought of her first term, the specific terror of 28 13-year-olds who had pre-formed opinions of her based on things their parents had said. The night she'd spent sitting on the dungeon floor rewriting an entire curriculum because the textbook was 30 years out of date. The first time a student had come to her, not with a question about potions, but with a question about the kind of thing 11-year-olds eventually needed to ask someone. "No," she said. "It's harder and better." He absorbed this with the grave economy of someone who didn't speak much and therefore listened precisely. "Better how?" "I didn't expect to—" She paused, looking for the honest word. Found it. "Care this much. I thought I'd care about the material, about the craft of it. I do, but I care more about the students, and that wasn't what I prepared for." "Caring about things you didn't prepare for," he said, with a tone she couldn't fully decode. "That must be disorienting." "Profoundly," she said. Another silence. This one shorter, sharper. The quick, bright silence of two people who have said something more revealing than they intended and are simultaneously processing it. "I should go," he said. "Scorpius will be waiting." He's been looking forward to it. He mentioned the chess set. Something happened to his face. A softening so brief and involuntary that it was gone before it fully registered, like a candle flame bending toward a draft and straightening again before the movement could be catalogued. "He told you about the chess set." "He tells me most things these days." She kept her tone neutral, but she watched the softening's aftermath, the way his expression settled into something that wasn't quite warm, but was oriented in warmth's direction. "Is that all right?" He picked up the satchel. "Yes," he said. And then, with the precision of someone choosing a word that fit exactly and knowing it fit exactly, "It's more than all right." She heard them in the corridor 2 hours later. She was still in the dungeons, marking this time the essays she hadn't finished at breakfast, seated at her desk with a mug of tea that she was, for once, actively maintaining at the correct temperature. The torches had been lit by now, replacing their amber afternoon light with a warmer, more uneven glow of open flame. And the sound from the corridor arrived in fragments through the open door, a low adult voice and a lighter one, the irregular rhythm of conversation rather than argument. And then, briefly, unmistakably, Scorpius laughing. She didn't move. She listened to the laughter with the involuntary stillness of someone for whom the sound carried significance entirely out of proportion to its ordinary nature. Then she heard something else, a silence in the conversation. Not the comfortable silence of two people who had run out of words. A different quality, a loaded pause, the kind that preceded something difficult. She recognized it because she'd sat in the middle of enough of those to know their specific gravitational field. Then Scorpius's voice, quieter. "Do you miss her?" The corridor went very still. Hermione set down her quill without sound. Draco's response was too low to reach her. She didn't try to catch it, turned instead to her parchments, straightened them into alignment, pressed her fingertips flat against their surface with the deliberate pressure of someone occupying their hands while their mind went somewhere private. She thought about the letter. Eating is one of those things that goes quiet in grief, like colour in winter. She thought about the man who had written that sentence to his 11-year-old son. Not around the thing, not past it, but directly into it, with the clear, careful precision of someone who had decided that honesty was the only thing he had left to offer that couldn't be taken away. She thought about what it cost, that kind of honesty. She thought about grief that was tangled with guilt in the specific way of people who had loved someone and also failed them in some adjacent way and couldn't fully separate the two. She didn't know the particulars of Draco Malfoy's marriage, only what the prophet had reported, which was very little, and what she'd inferred from Scorpius, which was more. She knew that Astoria Greengrass had been ill for a long time. She knew that Scorpius had been born knowing his mother's life would be shorter than other mothers' lives. She knew from the one time Scorpius had mentioned it unprompted, sitting in her classroom after lessons, ostensibly reviewing notes, actually doing what grieving children did when they found a safe space, which was releasing things in small, irregular intervals, like steam from a valve. That his mother had been someone who made light out of difficult things, and that he missed that specific quality with an ache that had no adequate word. She knew that Draco had loved her. The letter had told her that, too, in its way. Not in anything stated, but in the quality of the space left around the subject, the particular shape of the absence. Footsteps again now in the corridor, moving away from the dungeons. Then lighter footsteps moving in the other direction, toward the Slytherin common room. Then silence. Then a single footstep outside her door. She looked up. Draco stood in the doorway again. He had removed the travelling coat. He was in dark shirt and trousers, the collar open by one button, which she noted with the precise impartiality of someone noting an observable fact. His expression was the composed neutrality she had catalogued in the Great Hall, but with something underneath it now. A fault line she could see, not because it was visible, but because she had been paying attention for 2 weeks, and she knew what composed neutrality looked like when it was doing a great deal of work. "I didn't know you were still here," he said. "I was marking." He looked at the desk, the essays, the tea, the quill set down with its nib aligned precisely. Something crossed his face. "I owe you an apology," he said. She waited. "When I came earlier," he said, "I was—" A fractional pause, the pause of a man who chose words the way she chose reagents, for accuracy rather than ease. Abrupt. About Scorpius, about credit. "I was managing something, and I managed it at you, which was unfair." "You were grateful, and you didn't know where to put it," she said. His jaw tightened. Not in anger. She was learning to read the difference. In recognition. "Yes. That's not something you need to apologize for." "I'm apologizing anyway." "All right." She looked at him. The torchlight between them was warm and uneven, casting everything in the amber of old rooms and old conversations. Apology accepted. He didn't leave. She didn't return to her marking. The torches in the corridor guttered slightly. A draught from somewhere, the castle breathing, and the light between them shifted and resettled, and the silence in the room was not empty, but full of the specific gravity of two people standing in a doorway on opposite sides of it, who have not yet decided whether to step across. "He seems better," Hermione offered. "He does." Draco's gaze moved briefly to the window. The night outside, complete now, the lake invisible beneath it. "He showed me his transfiguration notes. They're very organized. He color codes them by subject." "He does," she said. "He started doing it in the 3rd week. I may have given him a set of colored quills." The fault line in his composure opened by 1 degree. "You gave my son stationery. It was educational stationery. Granger." He was struggling to organize the volume of new information, and a visual categorization system seemed Granger. There was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not warmth exactly, but the structural antecedent of warmth. The place in the architecture where warmth would eventually live. "Thank you." She stopped talking. He looked at her across the doorway with that particular quality of looking that she had been trying not to find interesting, and she looked back with the directness that was the only mode of attention she'd ever been able to sustain. And for a moment, the dungeon corridor with its guttering torches and its smell of stone and old magic and the cold breath of an October night was simply two people standing in honest proximity with everything unnamed. "I'll be back on the 14th of November, he said. "If that's—" A pause that did considerable work. "If there are any concerns about Scorpius, before then, you can owl me." "I know," she said. "I'm giving you explicit permission," he said, with a precision that suggested the distinction mattered to him. "Not just leaving an open door. I'm asking you to." She held his gaze. "I'll owl you." He nodded, picked up the satchel, the chess set she remembered, and felt something shift at the thought of the game they must have played, the two of them, somewhere in the castle, father and son, and the deliberate silence of a board game that asked nothing of its players except presence. "Good night." "Good night, Malfoy." He moved down the corridor. She listened to his footsteps, that particular gait, unhurried and self-possessed, until they turned the corner and the dungeon returned to the sounds it kept for itself. The low breath of torches, the far-off murmur of the lake, the castle settling into the deep grammar of another night. She looked at her tea, still warm. She pressed her fingertips to the side of the mug and sat for a long time without marking anything, while the torches burned and the corridor held the memory of footsteps that had paused and not quite left. The drawing appeared on a Tuesday. Hermione found it at the end of a double lesson with the third years, tucked beneath the near leg of the workstation closest to the door, the station that Scorpius occupied every Thursday and, as of 3 weeks ago, every Tuesday as well. He had begun attending her open classroom hours without being invited, which she had managed by the simple strategy of not acknowledging it directly and ensuring there was always a spare stool at the workstation nearest the ingredient shelves, where the light was best and the draft from the corridor was least insistent. She had not told him the stool was for him. He had not asked. They had arrived by the particular unspoken negotiation of two people who understand each other without requiring the architecture of explicit agreement at a Tuesday and Thursday arrangement that suited them both. He would work. She would work. Occasionally, one of them would say something. More often, they wouldn't. It was, she had privately decided, one of the better things in her week. The drawing had slipped from his bag, presumably in the organized chaos of 11 third years, packing up and filing out with the focused urgency of students who had Quidditch practice next and cared about that considerably more than the properties of Ashwinder eggs. She found it when she was collecting the spare parchment from the stations, a habit left from her own school years, the automatic tidying of shared spaces, and she almost set it with the recycled parchment pile before the image registered. She smoothed it flat on her desk. It was done in ink, careful and detailed in the way of someone who had been drawing for years without instruction, the particular quality of self-taught precision, technically accomplished, but not technically constrained, willing to spend more time on the things that mattered and less on the things that didn't. The line work was confident where it needed to be, and tentative only in the places where the subject required delicacy. The subject was two figures, a boy, small, seated on a workstation stool, his posture recognizable in the slight forward lean and the careful placement of his hands. And beside him, not hovering, not looming, but simply present in the way that presence could be rendered in ink, a woman with a great deal of hair, drawn with evident affection and a certain delighted chaos in every curling line, standing with one hand resting on the workstation's edge and her face turned toward the boy. The woman's face was not fully detailed, but the posture was unmistakable. The quality of the attention in the tilt of her head, the angle of her body. It was rendered with the instinctive accuracy of someone drawing not from sight, but from feeling. Underneath, in Scorpius's careful hand, Tuesday. Just that. Not a caption, not an explanation. A title. As though the drawing were not of a place or a person, but of a time. As though Tuesday itself were the thing worth preserving. Hermione sat down. She sat with the drawing for a long time, her hands flat on the desk to either side of it, the dungeon quiet around her in the deep mid-morning stillness that fell between lessons when the corridors emptied and the castle briefly exhaled. Outside the narrow windows, November had arrived with full commitment. The lake was the color of iron, the grounds stripped to their essential geometry, the sky a flat pale that gave light without warmth. She thought about Scorpius drawing this, about the particular private deliberateness of a child who records something not because they have been asked to remember it, but because they are afraid of forgetting. She thought about what it meant to be the thing a grieving child was afraid of forgetting. The thought arrived with a weight she hadn't prepared for. Not the comfortable weight of professional satisfaction, but something rawer, more personal, the specific gravity of being needed in a way that had nothing to do with expertise. She pressed her fingertips against the edge of the drawing and felt the slight roughness of the parchment's tooth, the dried ink raised fractionally above the surface. She had not expected this. She had expected to teach. She had expected to care, in the general way she cared about all her students, with competence and consistency and appropriate distance. She had not expected a small grey-eyed boy to work his way through every boundary she'd constructed around the word appropriate and simply establish himself on the other side of all of them, looking back at her with his father's eyes and his mother's. She didn't know. She'd never known Astoria, but she imagined his mother's capacity for direct feeling. She was folding the drawing carefully along its original creases when she heard the footsteps. Not Scorpius. Wrong time of day, wrong weight. She had learned all the footsteps that mattered in this corridor. She had exactly 3 seconds to place the drawing face down on the desk before Draco Malfoy appeared in her doorway. He was not expected until the 14th. It was the 9th. She registered this in the same moment she registered his expression, which was composed, technically, in all the ways his expression was always composed. But the composure was doing considerably more work than usual. He was in travelling clothes again, the charcoal coat, but he hadn't removed it, which meant he hadn't been here long enough to settle into the castle's warmth. He had come directly here, which meant either he had visited Scorpius first and been directed here, or he had come here first, which was a different thing entirely, and she was not going to examine the distinction right now. "You're early," she said. "I had a meeting in Edinburgh that concluded yesterday instead of today." He stepped into the room. His gaze moved across it with the automatic cataloguing she recognized, the ingredient stations, the essay pile, the cold cauldrons, and then to her desk and the face-down parchment on it. "I thought I'd come directly. Scorpius will be pleased. He'll be in lessons until 3. He checked the watch at his wrist, a detail she hadn't noticed before. Silver, plainly made by the standards of what his family could have afforded, worn on the left wrist with a scratch across the face that suggested years of use. "I have 2 hours. The implication of the sentence organized itself between them without ceremony. "You came to my classroom," she said. "You said I could owl you with concerns." "I said you could owl me," she said. "Owling implies a bird and a letter, and at minimum the distance between here and wherever you were this morning." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more the muscular suggestion of one, the tectonic precursor to something that would require more seismic activity than he was currently willing to generate. There was a concern I couldn't adequately convey in a letter. She waited. The dungeon held its breath in the particular way of old stone that had absorbed centuries of consequential conversations and had no opinion about one more. "His head of house wrote me," Draco said. He moved to the nearest workstation and stood beside it, not sitting, Never sitting, she noticed, unless he decided to commit to a conversation, and he hadn't decided yet. She said Scorpius has been spending his free periods in your classroom. He has. She seemed to think I should know. She's thorough, Hermione said. It's one of her better qualities. She also seemed to think, another pause, the kind that preceded precision, that Scorpius had become attached. Her word. Yes. The word landed flat and undefended because she had decided, some time between finding the drawing and hearing his footsteps, that she was not going to qualify this. It was true. Scorpius was attached. She was, in ways she was still mapping, attached in return. Qualifying true things was a kind of dishonesty she found more exhausting than the truth. Draco's eyes found her. Something in his expression shifted from composed and managing to something less categorizable. And you're all right with that? I'm not all right, or not all right with it, she said. It simply is. Children attached to safe people. It's what they're supposed to do. You're his professor. I'm aware of what I am. It could become... He stopped. His hand moved to the workstation's edge and rested there, the long fingers loose against the stone, a posture that looked relaxed and wasn't. I don't want him hurt. If there's a limit to this, to what you're able to give in the context of... Another stop, and she understood that he was trying to construct a sentence that protected his son without accusing her of anything. A structurally complex task, in the context of it being a professional relationship with inherent parameters. Malfoy. Her voice was quiet and precise. I'm not going anywhere. The echo of 2 weeks ago, the same 4 words in this same room, in a different configuration, moved through the air between them. She saw him recognize it, saw the recognition do something to his face that his composure couldn't fully contain. You said that before, he said. I meant it before. The silence that followed was long and had a specific texture, dense, close woven, the silence of something being decided rather than avoided. He looked away first. His gaze moved to the window, the iron lake, the stripped November grounds. He was quiet long enough that she returned to her desk and sat, not to create distance, but because standing had begun to feel like a performance of readiness she didn't need to maintain. That was when he saw the drawing. She had placed it face down, but the edge of it was visible beyond the essay pile, and something about its size or its position, or simply the particular quality of his attention, which she was beginning to understand missed very little, made his gaze stop there. What's that? He said. She could have said, spare parchment. She could have moved the essay pile over it. She chose, instead, the honest route, because she'd already committed to it, and because the drawing was not a thing to be managed. She turned it over. He crossed the room. He stood before her desk and looked at the drawing for a long time. She watched him look at it, watched the controlled surface of his face absorb the image with the specific stillness of someone receiving something that has gone directly past every defensive perimeter and arrived at the unprotected center without asking permission. His son, drawn with care, and beside him, the woman his son had titled Tuesday, as though she were not a person, but a fixed point in the week, a reliable coordinate. His jaw moved, a small motion, almost imperceptible. His hand lifted from his side and settled against the desk's edge in the same restrained gesture she'd catalogued before. But this time, it was not restrained in the sense of managed. It was restrained in the sense of a man gripping something, because the alternative was to reach for something else. "He drew you," Draco said. "Yes. He's never—" He stopped, started again with the careful deliberateness of someone choosing accuracy over protection. "Since his mother died, he hasn't drawn people. He used to. Constantly. Every surface, every spare piece of parchment. He drew her, mostly. After, he stopped." Hermione's throat tightened with a swift, involuntary constriction she pressed down before it could reach her face. "He didn't tell me that." "He wouldn't." Draco's eyes were still on the drawing. "He protects things that matter. He learned it young." The silence between them was different now. It had shed the last of its strategic quality and become something simpler and more difficult. Two adults in a cold dungeon, standing on opposite sides of a desk with a child's drawing between them that had said, in two ink figures and a single word, more than either of them had managed in 3 weeks of careful conversation. Hermione looked at Draco's hand on the desk's edge. The white pressure at his knuckles, the slight tension along the tendon, the physical grammar of someone holding themselves very carefully in place. "You can keep it," she said. "If you'd like." He looked up from the drawing to her, and the quality of that look, direct and unguarded, and carrying something she had no established category for, held for 3 full seconds before he looked away. "He drew it for you," he said. "He left it here." "That's not the same as drawing it for you." "No," she agreed. "But I think it might be the same as leaving it for both of us." The sentence arrived between them, and neither of them reached to dismantle it. Outside, a rook called once across the iron-coloured lake. The torches in the dungeon burned their steady amber. The drawing lay on the desk between 2 people who were becoming, in the slow and incremental way of things that matter, something neither of them had a word for yet. But that Scorpius Malfoy, with 11 years of clear-eyed attention and a pot of ink and the instinct of a child who knew what safe looked like when he found it, had captured perfectly on a Tuesday afternoon and left where it could be found. Draco straightened. His hand left the desk's edge. "I should go," he said. "Find him before his lessons finish." "3rd floor," she said. "Transfiguration. He'll be out at 3. He nodded, moved toward the door, paused at the threshold, not the hesitation of indecision, but the pause of a man who has thought of something and is deciding whether to say it. "Granger." She looked up. "Tuesday," he said. Just that. Referencing the drawing, referencing the word beneath it, and in doing so referencing everything the word contained. The routine, the stool by the ingredient shelves, the 2 people who worked in companionable quiet and occasionally said something, and more often didn't. She held his gaze. "Tuesday," she confirmed. He left. She listened to his footsteps move away down the corridor, that particular unhurried gait. And then she looked at the drawing still lying on her desk, the 2 ink figures, the careful lines of a boy drawing what safety looked like. She left it face up. The 3 broomsticks in November smelled of wood smoke and mulled wine, and the particular yeasty warmth of a place that had been feeding cold people for centuries, and had absorbed the gratitude of it into its walls. Hermione arrived late, not significantly late. 4 minutes by the clock above the bar, The kind of lateness that happened when a student stopped you in the corridor with a genuine question, and you were constitutionally incapable of saying not now to a genuine question. She unwound her scarf as she came through the door, the cold air releasing her in favor of the inn's warmth, and she was already scanning the room before she'd finished the motion. She found them at the window table. Draco and Scorpius, facing each other across a scrubbed oak surface, a chessboard between them in its middle stage. The game already 40 minutes old by the look of it, the pieces reduced to a careful late-game arrangement. Scorpius was leaning forward with his chin on his fist, in the specific posture of someone who was thinking very hard about something and wanted everyone to know it. Draco was leaning back, arms crossed, watching his son with an expression she was learning to read. The composed surface, the fault line underneath, and in the fault line, with Scorpius specifically, something that was not managed at all, something unguarded and attentive, and very nearly open. She had been about to signal Madame Rosmerta for her usual when she stopped, 3 steps inside the door, and simply looked at them. It was not a long moment, 5 seconds perhaps, but it had a particular quality, a crystalline, arrested quality, the way certain instants did when they were aware of themselves as instants, when something in the human nervous system registered this. Remember this before the conscious mind had processed why. Father and son at a window. November light, thin and honest, falling across the chessboard, and the 2 heads bent toward each other, one pale blonde and one pale blonde, though Scorpius's had a slight wave to it that she suspected came from his mother. The chess pieces casting long, small shadows, a half-drunk butterbeer at Scorpius's elbow, a cup of something darker at Draco's. She had not been invited exactly. She had been told by Scorpius 2 days ago in her classroom, in his particular indirect way of conveying information, which was to mention it while pretending to review notes, as though the information were incidental rather than the actual point. Father's coming on Saturday for the Hogsmeade visit. I expect it'll be cold. A pause. Are you supervising the Hogsmeade visit, Professor? She had said that she was. He had returned to his notes with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished something. Now she crossed the 3 broomsticks to their table, and Scorpius looked up before she was halfway there. He always registered her approach, some attuned alertness she'd noticed before. And his face did the thing it did. The particular recalibration that wasn't quite a smile, but contained all the structural elements of one, waiting for sufficient reason. You're late, he said. 4 minutes, she said. I was waylaid by a 3rd year with an excellent question about fermentation temperatures. Did you answer it? Thoroughly. She pulled out the chair beside him and sat. Across the table, Draco watched this with an expression that gave away almost nothing. Almost, because she had spent enough hours reading the subtle grammar of his face to catch the very small shift that meant something had registered. She met his eyes briefly. Malfoy. Granger. A pause, and then with a precise neutrality that somehow managed to convey the opposite of neutrality. You're late. So, I've been told. She looked at the board. Who's winning? I am, Scorpius said. You're not, Draco said, with the tone of a man who had been saying this for approximately 40 minutes and was prepared to continue saying it as long as necessary. I have a strategy. You have an aspiration, Draco said. A strategy involves knowing what the other player is planning to do. He glanced at Hermione. He's been attempting a Queen's Gambit for 20 minutes, despite the fact that I've closed that line completely. I'm waiting you out, Scorpius said. You're being optimistic in the face of material evidence, Draco said. It's admirable. It won't work. Scorpius looked at Hermione with the expression of someone seeking independent adjudication. She looked at the board. She had been an adequate chess player at school. Adequate in the way that she was adequate at most things, which was to say better than adequate, and simply honest enough to know the ceiling of her competence. She could read a mid-game position. She looked at it for approximately 10 seconds. He's right, she told Scorpius. The Queen's Gambit line is closed, but... She tilted her head, looking again. Your knight on c6 has an interesting option you haven't used yet. Scorpius looked at the board with fresh intensity. Draco looked at Hermione. You play, he said. Not a question. I'm decent, she said. Ron taught me. He's rather extraordinary at it, so my education was thorough if occasionally demoralizing. Something moved across Draco's expression. Complex, brief, the particular complexity of hearing a name that carries a history and responding to it with more nuance than simple animosity. She noted it, filed it. The knight, Scorpius murmured to himself, leaning closer to the board. Madame Rosmerta appeared at Hermione's elbow, and Hermione ordered a butterbeer with the automatism of someone who had ordered the same thing in this establishment since she was 13, and then found herself sitting in the window warmth of the Three Broomsticks on a November Saturday, watching Scorpius Malfoy move his knight with the careful gravity of a child making a consequential decision. While the November light came through the old glass and striped the table in pale gold, and the chess pieces cast their long, small shadows, and across the table, Draco watched his son, and then, in the quiet interval while Scorpius thought, watched her. Scorpius lost, inevitably, though less quickly than he would have without the knight, and received the defeat with the composure of someone who had been losing to this particular opponent for years and had developed a philosophical relationship with the experience. You knew about the knight the whole time, he said to his father. Yes. Why didn't you close that line too? Draco gathered the pieces into their box with the practiced efficiency of long ritual. Because you needed to see there was still a move available. Otherwise, you'd have resigned 20 minutes ago. Scorpius absorbed this. That's... He paused, arriving at the word by a route that was clearly longer than expected. That's kind. It's chess, Draco said. But he said it to the chess box, not to Scorpius, which told her something. The food had arrived while they were finishing the game. Madame Rosmerta had long since perfected the timing of the Hogsmeade visit crowd, the large plates of shepherd's pie and the basket of bread, and the small dish of roasted parsnips that Hermione had not ordered, and that appeared to be simply a gift from the kitchen, the way good establishments added unrequested warmth. Scorpius served himself with the focused attention he brought to most physical tasks, and then, the motion so natural it had no performance in it whatsoever, turned and spooned a portion onto Hermione's plate. She looked at her plate, then at him. He was already reaching for the bread basket. Across the table, Draco had gone very still. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at Scorpius, who was now buttering bread with the uncomplicated satisfaction of someone engaged in a task they found straightforward. And she felt the warmth arrive in her chest. Not the sharp warmth of unexpected kindness, but the slower, deeper warmth of something that had been building for weeks and had quietly, in the ordinary motion of a boy serving food, become undeniable. She picked up her fork. "Thank you," she said to Scorpius. He looked up, seemed faintly surprised that she'd noted it. "You're the one who told me to eat," he said simply, as though this explained and completed the entire transaction. She looked then. She couldn't not, at Draco. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not the careful neutrality, not the managed composure, not the fault line beneath the surface she'd learned to read. Something much less constructed than any of those. Raw in the way that things were raw when they arrived too fast to be managed. When the defended surface was breached not by force, but by something so gentle and so specific that the defenses simply didn't know what to do with it. A woman picking up a fork, a boy returning a kindness, the smallest possible algebra of care. Draco looked away, picked up his own fork, said nothing. But he did not put the composed neutrality back on, and that, the absence of it, the unguarded way he moved through the rest of the meal, was the most consequential thing that happened at the Three Broomsticks that November Saturday. More consequential than anything said or done or decided, because it was the first time she had seen him simply be, without the architecture of management between himself and the room. They walked back to the castle in the late afternoon. The Hogsmeade visit had concluded. The student stream was flowing back up the path, the noise of 400 young people who had spent money and eaten sugar rising into the grey November air like weather. Hermione walked with Scorpius between them, which had happened without arrangement. He had simply positioned himself there when they left the inn, with the unconscious geometrical instinct of a child who understood where the warmth was. The path was uneven with frost-heaved stones and the particular mud of November that was neither fully frozen nor fully yielding. Hermione navigated it with the inattention of long familiarity. Scorpius narrated in his quiet, observational way various points of interest. A rook on a fence post, a peculiar cloud formation, the information that Neville Longbottom's herbology class had apparently done something in the greenhouses that made them smell extraordinary from the outside and terrible from the inside. Draco listened to his son with the full attention he gave to things that mattered, and occasionally responded with a question that showed he had been tracking every detail and the rhythm of it. Call and response, father and son, the particular music of a relationship finding its register after a difficult season, was something she walked beside and tried not to intrude upon. But she was part of it. She understood that now, walking between them on the frozen path. Not separate from it, not witnessing it from outside. Part of it, in the specific way that Scorpius's geometry insisted upon, the three-cornered warmth of it, the specific shape it made. Scorpius ran ahead suddenly, with the abrupt kinetic urgency of 11-year-olds who remember that they can run and decide to exercise the right. He'd spotted something, a shape on the path, some small creature that vanished into the grass before she could see what it was. And he was gone, 30 feet ahead, crouching to look. She and Draco walked beside each other. Not close. The path allowed for a foot of space between them, and they maintained it with the care of people who were aware of the space. But walking beside each other, their breath misting in the cold air, their footsteps finding an unintentional synchrony on the frozen ground. "He's happy today," Draco said. "Yes." She looked at Scorpius ahead, still crouched on the path. "He's been," she chose the word carefully, "lighter this week, since your visit on the 9th. A pause. "I shouldn't have come unannounced." "You can come unannounced," she said. "You don't need a scheduled reason." He was quiet for 3 steps. 4. "That's a more open invitation than I expected." "You're his father," she said. "This is where he lives. You should be here when you need to be." She felt, rather than saw, the fractional turn of his head, the small motion of someone looking at the person beside them without fully committing to the action. "And you?" he said. The question was quiet, stripped of inflection, the kind of question that had been assembled very carefully to carry as little weight as possible while carrying, in fact, considerable weight. "Do you need a scheduled reason?" She looked straight ahead. Scorpius had stood, was looking back at them, was starting to walk again. The castle was visible now through the trees, its towers rising into the grey sky with the imperturbable gravity of something that had been here for 1,000 years and expected to be here for 1,000 more. "I think," she said, with the careful honesty of someone who has decided on a direction and is committing to it, "that we've moved past scheduled reasons." The path crunched under their feet. Scorpius was 20 feet ahead, turned back to say something about the rook having reappeared. Draco lifted a hand to acknowledge him, a small gesture, automatic. His hand, returning to his side, passed very close to hers. Close enough that the back of his fingers brushed the back of hers. The briefest contact, the thinnest possible overlap of one person's space with another's, over in less than a second, neither of them having moved deliberately toward it. Neither of them moved deliberately away. They walked the remaining distance to the castle in a silence that was nothing like the careful silences of their early weeks. This one had a pulse to it, a low, steady frequency, like the first note of something held long before the rest of the music began. At the castle gates, Scorpius turned and walked backward for several steps, looking at both of them with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who was, beneath his 11 years of careful self-possession, extremely observant. "Are you coming to dinner?" he asked Hermione. "I eat at the staff table," she said. "But you could sit with us," he said. "You've done it before." She glanced at Draco. He was looking at the castle gates, his profile composed, offering nothing, but offering nothing in the deliberate way of someone who has decided not to influence a particular outcome, which was itself an answer. "Not tonight," she said to Scorpius, "but I'll see you Tuesday." Scorpius accepted this with the equilibrium of someone banking it for later. He turned and ran ahead through the gates, his footsteps bright and quick on the stone. Draco paused at the gate. She paused beside him. The castle rose before them, lit now with the first gold of the evening torches, windows beginning to warm against the darkening sky, the November dusk coming fast and complete, the grounds losing their colour to it. The cold was sharpening, the frost returning in the wake of the afternoon's thin sun. "Dinner," Draco said, without looking at her. The word alone, offered without completion. She understood the offer. She felt it arrive with the particular clarity of something she had been, she realized, expecting. Not soon, not yet, but at some point on a trajectory that had been drawing itself for weeks. "Next time," she said. He looked at her then, just for a moment, and the look had none of the old calculation in it, only something honest and unresolved and present. "Next time," he agreed. He walked through the gates. She followed, and the castle received them both into its warmth. And somewhere above them, Scorpius's footsteps were already running towards something the castle held that was his. And the evening closed around the three of them like a hand gently cupped. The portrait of Dumbledore was in the habit of pretending to sleep. Hermione had learned this in her first term, had learned to distinguish the quality of his stillness when he was genuinely absent from the canvas, and the quality of it when he was simply exercising what she suspected was a lifelong preference for receiving information before announcing his presence. The former had a kind of vacancy to it, the painted chair somehow emptier than a chair could logically be. The latter had a different texture, a stillness with a tension in it, the stillness of someone listening. He was listening now. She stood at the window of the small study adjacent to McGonagall's office, a room she used on evenings when the dungeon grew too cold for comfort, and the walk to her own quarters felt like more distance than she wanted between herself and the castle's inhabited warmth. It had a fireplace, 2 chairs, a desk she never used, and the Dumbledore portrait on the east wall, hung there by McGonagall in what Hermione privately suspected was an act of deliberate mischief. The fire had burned down to a deep amber, the kind of low-sustained heat that asked nothing of the room except presence. Outside the window, December had arrived with the particular finality of Scottish winter. The grounds were under the first real frost, the lake sealed at its edges, the sky tonight so clear it hurt to look at, every star sharp and distinct in the cold like points of ice. She had been standing at the window for 11 minutes. She knew this because she had checked her watch at the beginning of the 11 minutes, in the moment she decided she needed to say something out loud to something that would not repeat it. And the portrait's feigned sleep had seemed, as it generally did, like an adequate audience. "I've done something," she said. To the window, initially, the cold glass, the starred sky beyond it. Then, because the window offered nothing, and the portrait was there. Or, "I'm about to do something. I'm not entirely certain which one it is." The portrait said nothing. Its stillness had the listening quality. "He brought her a different kind of tea last time," she said. "The house elf at the 3 broomsticks. He'd asked Madame Rosmerta to have them use the Darjeeling instead of the breakfast blend, because I'd mentioned in passing, weeks ago I barely remember mentioning it, that I preferred it in the evenings." She paused. He remembered that. The fire shifted. A log settled, sending a small cascade of sparks up the flue. "I know what it means when someone remembers something like that," she said. "I'm not naive. I've known what it meant for at least 3 weeks, and I've been managing the knowledge, filing it somewhere I didn't have to look at directly." She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window. "That's his technique, actually. The filing. I appear to have adopted it." A sound from the portrait. Not words, just the soft inhalation of someone surfacing from performed sleep into admitted wakefulness. "My dear," said Dumbledore's portrait, in the tone of someone who has been waiting with considerable patience for the moment to speak. "You have been standing at that window long enough to have resolved this question several times over. I'm aware of that. Then perhaps the difficulty is not the resolution, but the permission." She looked at the portrait. It was, as always, rendered with a particular accuracy of someone who had sat for it while alive and left enough of themselves in the collaboration that the result carried genuine resonance. The half-moon spectacles, the expression of benevolent precision, the sense of a mind that found the universe endlessly interesting and was in no hurry to stop looking at it. We were, she began, and stopped, because the word enemies felt like a category that had quietly ceased to apply, and she wasn't sure when it had happened, only that the transition had been gradual, and the result was that she was standing at a cold window in December, unable to name what they were now with any of the words she'd have used 6 weeks ago. "You were children in a difficult place," the portrait said, "who made the errors that children in difficult places reliably make, and who have both, in the years since, become considerably more complicated people." That's a generous reading. It is an accurate reading. Generosity that is also accurate is simply honesty, my dear. She turned from the window, sat in one of the chairs by the dying fire, pulling her knees up in the way she only ever sat when she was certain she was not being professionally observed. The chair was old and deep and received her with the quiet accommodation of furniture that has had many people sit in it and thinks nothing of one more. "Scorpius," she said, the name alone, a complete thought. "Yes," the portrait said. "He's become..." She looked at the fire. "He's become important to me, in a way I didn't architect and don't entirely know what to do with. And his father..." She stopped again, because important was the same word, and it was accurate for both of them, and that felt significant in a way she wasn't ready to examine in front of even a canvas audience. "You're afraid," the portrait said without judgment, "that one is the justification for the other, that you are rationalizing the father through the child." The accuracy of it sat in her chest like a cold stone. "Yes. And are you?" She looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about the 3 broomsticks and the hand that had passed close to hers on the frozen path. She thought about his face when Scorpius had served food onto her plate, the unguarded, unmistakable quality of a man moved by something he hadn't expected. She thought about the letter, the wood smoke scent of good parchment. Eating is like colour in winter, it comes back. She thought about a dungeon doorway and a cup of tea. "No," she said, "they're separate. I know the difference." "Then," the portrait said, with the gentle finality of someone arriving at a point they had been heading toward since the beginning of the conversation, "perhaps the question is not whether you've crossed a line, but whether the line was ever where you believed it to be." The fire crackled. Outside, the starred sky held its cold brilliance. She was looking at the fire and thinking, with the particular intense stillness of someone arriving at a thing they have been approaching for a long time, when she heard the door. Not a knock. The door to the small study had been left open, the way she always left it when she was in a room alone. some deep habit from years of preferring to know that the corridor existed, that the space was not sealed. The sound was not a knock, but a footstep, a single footstep, paused at the threshold, with the quality of someone who has arrived at a door they didn't expect to find occupied. She turned. Draco Malfoy stood in the doorway. He was in the clothes of someone who had been working. Dark shirt, no coat, the collar open, his sleeves pushed to the elbow, with the kind of carelessness that happened when a person forgot to be careful about appearances because they had been focused on something else. He was holding a cup, a small cup, plain, the kind of cup conjured rather than fetched, the kind of cup a person made for themselves in a private moment. There was another cup in his other hand. He looked at her, at the portrait, at the dying fire and the chair she'd folded herself into with her knees up, an entirely unguarded posture she had approximately 1 second to register before she decided with deliberate effort not to alter it. "I didn't know anyone was in here," he said. "The door was open," she said, which was not an accusation, simply an observation, simply the truth. She had left the door open, she had been the open door, and he had arrived at it. He looked at the second cup in his hand. A pause, brief, but containing a decision. He crossed the room. He set the cup on the windowsill beside the cold glass, not beside her chair. The windowsill, a piece of neutral territory, an inch of stone between the warmth of the fire and the cold of the night outside, a place where something could be left without being pressed. "It's Darjeeling," he said. She looked at the cup on the windowsill, the small curl of steam rising from it, pale and precise in the firelight. She looked at it for long enough that the silence became a third thing in the room, alongside them. "Thank you," she said. He didn't sit. He went to the window, the other side of it from the cup, standing where she had stood 11 minutes ago, looking at the same starred sky. She looked at his profile, the composed line of it, the familiar fault beneath the surface, and underneath the fault something she could see clearly now, something that had been building for weeks in the particular slow way of things that matter, gaining weight and reality through repetition and proximity and the accumulation of small, honest moments. "Scorpius asked me today," Draco said to the window, "whether Professor Granger was a friend." She was very still. "What did you tell him?" she said. "I told him I thought so." A pause. He seemed unsurprised. "He's perceptive. Extraordinarily." A beat, and then with the kind of precision that meant the word had been chosen rather than arrived at. "He also asked if I liked you." The fire settled again. The room breathed. "And," she said. The word came out quieter than she'd intended. Draco turned from the window. He looked at her across the room, across the dying fire and the 2 chairs and the distance she had stopped managing 3 weeks ago and had simply been existing inside, waiting for whatever it was to become clear enough to name. "I told him," Draco said slowly, with the careful precision of a man who had spent considerable private time arriving at an honest answer to an honest question. That "like" was a limited word for a complicated thing. The portrait on the east wall was entirely, profoundly silent. Hermione looked at Draco. He looked at her. The fire between them was low and amber and asked nothing of anyone. She reached out and picked up the cup from the windowsill. The ceramic was warm against her palms, the warmth of something made with intention, the specific warmth of a cup conjured by someone who had thought, she prefers Darjeeling in the evenings. She held it in both hands and felt the heat move into her fingers, which had been cold from the glass, and did not say anything for a moment, because some things were better received in silence. "Complicated how?" she said finally. He looked at her with the expression that had no management in it, the open, unguarded thing she had first seen at the Three Broomsticks, and had been seeing with increasing frequency since, as though the face he'd worn for 11 years of careful self-containment was becoming, in specific moments and in specific company, more effort than it was worth. "Complicated in the way," he said, "that things are when they arrive before you've prepared the appropriate framework for receiving them." She thought, "I know exactly what that means." She thought, "I have been living in that sentence for 6 weeks." She said, "Yes, just that." The single syllable, level and clear with all its weight acknowledged and none of it deflected. Something in his face shifted. A small seismic movement, a fault line becoming a fracture, the composed surface reorganizing itself around an interior that was no longer entirely contained. He looked at her with the expression of someone hearing a door open that they had not been certain would open. He didn't cross the room. He stayed at the window, and she stayed in her chair, and the Darjeeling steamed between her hands, and the portrait maintained its wise and absolute silence. And outside, the December stars held their cold and brilliant positions in the sky, each one a fixed point in the dark, each one exactly where it was supposed to be. "I should let you," he began. "You don't have to go," she said. He looked at her. She looked back with the steadiness she had built over 36 years of deciding that the honest thing and the difficult thing were usually the same thing, and then doing it anyway. He moved to the other chair. Not her chair, the other one on the opposite side of the fire, a foot of warm air between them. He sat. She held her cup. He held his. The fire breathed between them with its low amber patience, and the night pressed its cold-starred face against the glass, and neither of them spoke for a long time. It was the most honest silence she had ever sat inside. December deepened. The castle put on its winter self with the unhurried confidence of something that had done this 1,000 times. Frost on the inner window ledges by morning, the enchanted ceiling cycling through its shorter days with a kind of austere beauty, the torches burning higher and longer as though the stone walls were drawing warmth inward and hoarding it against the dark. The staircases groaned more at night. The suits of armor in the upper corridors exhaled visible breath, though no one had ever satisfactorily explained how. Scorpius had taken to spending his Sunday afternoons in Hermione's classroom with a dedication that had evolved over the weeks from tentative to territorial. He had a specific stool now, not assigned, simply claimed, the way certain children claimed spaces by returning to them with enough consistency that the space eventually acknowledged the arrangement. He kept a spare quill in the ingredient drawer at that station, tucked behind the dried billywig stings. And if this was the most Slytherin thing he'd done all term, Hermione had privately decided it was also the most healthy. On the 3rd Sunday of December, he fell asleep. It happened between one paragraph and the next. She heard the quality of his breathing change, the small audible shift from the concentrated rhythm of someone working to the slower, deeper rhythm of someone who had stopped. She looked up from her own desk to find him with his cheek resting on his Transfiguration essay, one hand still loosely around his quill, his face entirely relaxed in the way that children's faces were only relaxed in sleep, all the careful management gone, the gravity of the year's accumulated weight temporarily suspended. She did not wake him. She summoned a blanket from the supply cupboard with a wordless gesture, a small, soft thing charmed against the dungeon cold, and draped it over his shoulders without touching him, without disturbing the architecture of his sleep. Then she returned to her desk and continued marking. Draco arrived at 4:30. She had known he was coming. He'd sent an owl that morning, the small aristocratic Scops bird, a brief note in his vertical script. Arriving this afternoon, we'll find Scorpius in his common room. She had written back, "He's in my classroom, working." He had not replied, which she had taken as acknowledgement. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She always heard them first, the particular unhurried gait, and looked up as he reached the doorway. His gaze went immediately to Scorpius, the way it always did, that involuntary calibration, there, safe, present, and then registered the blanket and registered the sleep, and something in his face did the thing it did when Scorpius surprised him with his own wholeness. He looked at Hermione. She pressed a single finger to her lips. Not shh, simply, "Look at him. He's fine. He's sleeping." Draco looked at his son for a long moment. Then he stepped fully into the room, moving with the careful quiet of someone who had learned, somewhere in 11 years of parenthood, how not to wake a sleeping child. He came to stand beside the workstation and stood there looking down at Scorpius with his hands in his pockets and his coat still on, the cold of outside still in the fabric of it, and his face was open in a way she had come to understand. He permitted only in 2 conditions, when he had forgotten to close it and when he had decided she was safe to be open around. She thought, watching him watch his son, that she might be witnessing both conditions at once. After a while, he moved to the chair she kept near the ingredient shelves, not her desk chair, but the old wooden one she'd pulled in from the corridor weeks ago for Scorpius to use while she worked, and which had since become a general fixture, and sat in it with the quiet care of someone determined not to disturb the room's atmosphere. He looked at her desk, at the essays she was marking. "How many?" he said, barely above a murmur. 14, she said. 3rd years, Bezors and their applications. She set her quill down. "You didn't have to come in. I could have sent for you when he woke." "I know." He looked at his son again. "I'd rather be here." The sentence was simple and factual, but it carried the additional weight of sentences that mean more than their literal content. She let it settle without pressing it. The dungeon was quiet in its particular Sunday way. No students in the corridors, the distant sounds of the castle reduced to their minimum. A door somewhere, the muffled percussion of someone descending the main stairs, the low, constant murmur of the castle's own processes, the sounds it made when it thought no one was paying attention. "He looks younger," Draco said, still quietly, still looking at Scorpius. "When he sleeps. He carries a great deal during the day," she said. "More than he should, probably, at 11. He gets that from A pause, and the pause was complex, freighted with the particular complexity of a man navigating a sentence about a person he had lost in ways that were still not fully processed. From both sides, actually. Neither his mother nor I were uncomplicated children. She didn't respond immediately. She turned this over, the both sides, the easy way he'd included Astoria not as an absence, but as a continuing source, someone whose influence was still present in the way Scorpius sat and breathed and carried himself. She thought about what it cost to speak about someone like that. Not past tense, not sealed away, but ongoing. He has your precision, she said. And I think she searched for it, her willingness to feel things directly. He doesn't avoid the hard feelings. He goes toward them. Draco looked at her with a quality of attention she had learned to distinguish from his other kinds. This one had a particular stillness to it, the stillness of someone listening with more than their ears. She did that, he said quietly. Yes, the fire in the small dungeon grate. She'd lit it an hour ago against the growing cold, shifted and resettled. The blanket over Scorpius rose and fell in the slow, reliable rhythm of his breathing. She picked up her quill. Not to mark. She wasn't going to mark right now. But because it gave her hands something to do while she said the thing she had been deciding for several days whether to say. You don't have to talk about her, she said. But if you ever want to, I'm not fragile about it. I won't mishandle it. The silence that followed was long enough to have a shape. I know you won't, he said. Then, it's not fragility on your part that stopped me. He looked at the fire. His thumb moved once across the arm of the chair, the same contained gesture she'd catalogued in other rooms, other conversations, the small physical comma he placed in sentences when the next word required more precision than words easily afforded. It's mine, she nodded, said nothing. Let the honesty of it sit without being solved. It was an arranged marriage initially, he said. He said it to the fire, not to her, which he understood was the version of honesty he could currently sustain. Not against anyone's will. We were compatible, and we both knew what was expected of us, and we were. A pause, the particular pause of precision, fond of each other. It became more than fond. Not another stop, something being measured. Not the kind of love that arrives all at once, the kind that accrues, that becomes load-bearing without you noticing exactly when. She thought, I know something about that kind. She did not say it. She was ill when we married, he said. We knew. It was decided together, openly, honestly, which was the thing about Astoria that I don't think people outside that room ever fully understood. She was the most honest person I've known. She named everything. She refused to pretend. She said, I want this life, even though it's shorter than the other kind. I want Scorpius, even if I can't stay. I want... He stopped, and the stop was abrupt. The stop of someone who has walked far enough into a room that the door is no longer visible and has only just noticed. Hermione set down the quill. She looked at him, at the profile she'd spent weeks learning, the familiar fault line that was. Tonight, not a fault line, but simply an opening. His jaw was set. His hands, resting on the chair arms, were still. Everything was very controlled, and the control was the evidence, the precise sign of how much was underneath it. She said, She sounds extraordinary. He turned to look at her. The turn was slow, and the expression he turned with was one she had not seen before. It was grief, clear and unmanaged, not performed and not suppressed, simply present in his face, the way weather was present in a landscape, changing everything's colour without changing anything's form. "She was," he said. The fire breathed. Scorpius slept. Hermione held the silence with him the way she had learned in the months of his son's company to hold silences, not rushing to fill them, not using them as space to construct her response, simply being in them alongside. After a while, his shoulders dropped by some fraction, the particular release of someone who has set down a weight and is surprised by how long they've been carrying it. "I haven't said that to anyone," he said, "outside the family." "I know." He looked at her. "You couldn't possibly know." "You hold things very carefully," she said. "When you've been holding something a long time, you forget other people can see the effort of it." A pause. "I've been watching you hold it for months." The expression that moved through his face at that was complex and swift. Gratitude and resistance, and something else. Something that followed both of those and was quieter and more fundamental. He looked at her with the full, unmediated quality of his attention, and she looked back, and the fire held its amber warmth between them. "Granger," he said. Why are you—" he began, and stopped, and she understood that the sentence had 3 or 4 possible endings, and he hadn't yet determined which one was true. "Why am I what?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "This. All of this. You didn't have to." "I know I didn't have to." "He's not your responsibility." "No," she said. "He's not." She held his gaze with the steadiness she had been building toward for months, the steadiness of someone who has arrived at a position and is no longer uncertain of it. "Neither are you. People aren't responsibilities. They're choices. I choose this. Both of you." The words arrived in the room with a weight she had known they carried and released anyway, because the time for managed distance had conclusively passed, and she was, at her core, a person who preferred the map to match the territory. Draco looked at her for a long time. His hand moved on the chair arm. A small motion, barely a motion, the ghost of one, toward her desk, toward the space where her hands were. It stopped before it completed itself, but it moved. She looked at his hand, then at him. His jaw was set with the effort of something, not resistance, not suppression, but the specific effort of a man who has been controlled for a very long time and is trying to determine whether it is safe to stop. She wanted to tell him, "It is." She wanted to close the distance herself. She was not, by nature, a person who waited for things to come to her. But she understood, with the particular precision of someone who had been paying close attention for months, that this had to be his, that the unlocking had to come from inside, or it would not hold. Scorpius made a small sound in his sleep. Both of them looked at him. He shifted, settling deeper, pulling the blanket closer with the unconscious self-knowledge of a sleeping child. When they looked back at each other, something had changed. Not in the room. The room was the same, the fire the same cold pressing at the window glass. The change was more interior than that. The thin remaining distance between what this was and what it was becoming had, in the space of a glance shared over a sleeping child, reduced itself to almost nothing. Draco stood from his chair. She thought for one arrested moment that he was leaving, but he didn't move toward the door. He moved toward her desk. He stopped beside it, close, closer than their usual careful geography, the distance of someone who has made a decision and is standing in the evidence of it. He looked down at her. She looked up. His hand, the one that had moved and stopped on the chair arm, moved again. And this time, it did not stop. It came to rest on her desk, 6 inches from hers. Not touching, but present, deliberate, close enough that the warmth of it reached her skin. "Granger," he said. His voice was low and very steady, the steadiness of something decided rather than managed. "Malfoy," she said, with the same low steadiness. "I need to tell you something." He paused. "And I'm going to need you not to—" Another pause. "Not to make it into a question when I'm done. Because I've been—" He exhaled once, quiet and controlled. "I've been assembling this for a long time, and if you dismantle it with a question, I'll lose the whole thing." She set her quill down with care, folded her hands on the desk. "All right." He looked at her hands, at her face, at the fire once, briefly, then back to her, and the look was the most open thing she had ever seen on him, the completely undefended thing, the thing underneath all the architecture. "I think about you," he said, "in the way I think about things that have become necessary. Not wanted initially, necessary. The way breathing is necessary, the way light is. Not chosen, simply required, and you only notice the requirement when the thing is absent." He paused. The pause was not hesitation, it was precision. "I notice when you're absent, Granger. I've been noticing for months, and I've been filing the noticing somewhere I didn't have to look at it, and I've run out of that particular storage." The fire breathed. Scorpius breathed. The castle breathed around them all. She did not make it into a question. She turned her hand over on the desk, a slow, deliberate motion, palm up and opening, and let it rest there, an inch from his. His hand moved the remaining inch. His fingers closed over hers. Not tightly, not with urgency, but with the particular careful pressure of something irreversible being done gently. His hand was warm, and his grip was steady, and the contact ran from her fingers to her wrist, to somewhere considerably deeper than her wrist, and she felt it the way she felt things that were true. Without surprise, with the profound, settling recognition of something finally arrived at its correct place. They sat like that, his hand over hers, her palm against the desk, the fire burning down to its amber core, until Scorpius stirred and the blanket slipped from his shoulder, and Draco quietly released her hand to cross the room and resettle it. And the motion of his doing that, the gentleness of it, the complete and practiced tenderness, did something to her chest that all the careful words in the world could not have managed. He came back to the desk, did not take her hand again, but sat on the edge of the desk beside her, close enough that the sleeve of his coat rested against her shoulder. Neither of them moved away. Outside, the December dark pressed its face against the glass, and the stars were very far away and very fixed, and inside the dungeon, the fire held its warmth like a kept promise. The last day of term arrived the way last days always did, with too much noise and not enough time, the castle exhaling its accumulated semester in a single sustained breath of trunks dragged across stone floors, and owls released in clusters from the owlery, and the particular high-frequency energy of 400 students who had survived another term and were prepared to celebrate the fact at significant volume. Hermione stood at her classroom window and watched the grounds fill with the organized chaos of departure. The carriages had begun arriving at 9. By past, the path from the castle to the Hogsmeade station was a moving river of robes and luggage, and the excited percussion of holiday plans being exchanged at the top of several hundred voices. The sky above it all was the particular white of a Scottish winter that had decided on snow and was assembling the necessary components with unhurried patience. The clouds dense and low, the air perfectly still, the grounds holding their breath in the way of landscapes that know what's coming. She had said goodbye to most of her students already. The third years in the corridor after breakfast, the second years during the brief administrative gathering McGonagall had organized in the Great Hall. She had distributed the last of the marked essays, received the customary end-of-term cards with a mixture of warmth and mild mortification that characterized her relationship with student affection, and confirmed office hours for January with the 3 students who would owl her over the holidays, regardless of whether she confirmed them. She was, technically, finished. She was still standing at the window. She knew why. She was 36 years old and self-aware past the point of comfortable self-deception, and she knew exactly why she was standing at a dungeon window watching the departure rather than completing her own end-of-term packing, which was modest because she was spending most of the holiday here in the castle's quiet winter mode, which she had discovered she preferred to the alternatives. Scorpius's trunk had been taken down that morning by a second year who'd earned the errand privilege. Draco had arrived on the platform at 10. She hadn't gone to the platform yet. She had been, with ruthless honesty, working up to it, which was embarrassing, she told herself, for a person who had faced considerably more consequential moments without this quality of internal static. But those moments had generally involved clear categories, dark wizards and moral imperatives, and questions with definitive answers. This was different. This was the accumulated weight of 4 months of slow accretion, of Tuesdays and chess games, and Darjeeling left on windowsills and a hand closed over hers in a dungeon firelight, arriving at a single platform, a single departure, the particular end-of-chapter quality of a train about to leave. She put on her coat. The platform at Hogsmeade Station was its customary end-of-term spectacle, steam from the Scarlet engine billowing across the platform in slow, dramatic clouds, the conductor moving with practiced authority through the crowd, the sound of a school condensed into its most essential form, the students, the trunks, the goodbyes. She found them near the middle of the platform. Scorpius saw her first. He always saw her first. That particular attuned alertness, the forward orientation of his whole posture at her approach, the door opened to its specific width. He was standing beside a substantial stack of luggage that suggested Draco had sent considerably more than the regulation trunk. And he was wearing a travelling cloak in dark grey that made him look simultaneously very small and very dignified. He crossed the platform to her with 3 quick steps and then stopped, with the slightly awkward deceleration of someone who had intended to do something and was recalculating the appropriate form. She solved it by crouching down to his level, a motion she'd made hundreds of times with students, but which felt, with Scorpius, like a different kind of meeting. "Happy Christmas," she said. He looked at her with the clear-eyed assessment she had come to love, and she let the word sit in her chest without qualifying it. Love. It was the right word. It was the accurate word, and accuracy mattered more than comfort. He had grey eyes, and his father's precision, and some quality entirely his own that she didn't have a name for yet, but recognized the way you recognized things you'd been looking for without knowing it. "Happy Christmas," he said. Then, with the directness of someone who had decided to say the thing rather than manage the saying of it, "I don't want to go." "I know. It's very quiet there," he said. "At home." She thought about the house. She'd never seen it, but she'd assembled it from the incremental information Scorpius released in her classroom. The high ceilings, the library that needed better organization, the kitchen that was too formal for breakfast. A house with too many rooms for 2 people, the autumn coming in at the edges. "Your father will be there," she said. "Yes." A pause. "It's different quiet when he's there. Less empty." He considered his own sentence with the gravity he brought to precision. "But you won't be there." The simplicity of it arrived in her chest with the full force of everything it contained. She looked at him steadily. "January is not very far." 23 days, he said, which told her he had counted, which told her more than 23 days' worth of things. 23 days, she agreed. "And I'll be here when you get back. Same classroom, same stool, same drawer with your quill in it." He nodded. The nod had the quality of someone filing something into the category of fixed points, reliable coordinates, the category she had apparently occupied in his internal map for some time now. He held out his hand, a formal gesture slightly surprising, the handshake of someone who had been taught courtesy as a language and was deploying it for something it wasn't quite large enough to contain. She took his hand, held it. Then, because the handshake was insufficient and they both knew it, she pulled him forward and put her arms around him briefly, the clean, uncomplicated embrace of a person who has decided that the appropriate form is less important than the true form. He was stiff for approximately 1 second. Then he was not stiff at all. She felt his hands come up to hold the back of her coat. Small hands, her coat's wool rough under his fingers. And he held on with the particular grip of someone who doesn't do this easily and is therefore doing it completely. She held on too. When they separated, he looked at the ground for a moment and then looked up with his expression reassembled into its habitual composure, which was less successful than usual because his eyes were bright with a feeling he was 11 years old and hadn't yet learned to fully contain. "Go on," she said quietly. "Your father's waiting." He went. She watched him cross the platform and reach his father's side, watched Draco put a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, the automatic parental touch, the grounding gesture, and watched Scorpius lean into it fractionally, the minimal lean of someone receiving something they needed without requiring it to be named. Then Draco looked up. Across the platform, through the steam and the crowd and the 20 feet of December air between them, he looked at her. She didn't look away. He said something to Scorpius. She couldn't hear it. The platform noise was considerable. And Scorpius nodded and moved toward the train with his carry bag over one shoulder. And Draco walked across the platform toward her, with the unhurried gait she had mapped over 4 months, until she knew it the way she knew the dungeon corridor's particular echo, the way she knew the weight of a specific silence. He stopped in front of her. He was in his travelling coat, the dark charcoal wool, the collar up. She had a sudden, vivid recollection of the first time she'd seen him in this coat, standing in her classroom doorway with a leather satchel and an expression she hadn't yet learned to read. She knew it now. She knew the fault lines and what moved through them, and what the composure was doing when it worked hard and when it had stopped working entirely. It had stopped working entirely. He looked at her with the open, undefended quality that had become, in the private geography of their particular history, the most significant version of his face. "He'll be writing you," Draco said. "I'll write back. Daily, probably." "Good," she said. "I have a lot to say about the properties of Bundiman acid that I didn't get to cover this term." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not the ghost of a smile, but the thing itself, brief and real, and doing something entirely uncomplicated to her chest. "I'll warn him." The train exhaled a long breath of steam. The conductor's voice moved through the crowd with the authority of imminent departure. Around them, the platform was thinning, the last embraces and goodbyes condensing into the particular urgency of a whistle that hadn't blown yet but was about to. She should say something practical. She was good at practical. She had built entire structures out of it, had used it as scaffolding for years when the less practical things needed somewhere to lean. But standing in front of him in the December cold with the snow finally beginning, the first flakes arriving with the unhurried confidence of something that had been decided hours ago, she found that the practical things were not the things she wanted to say. "Malfoy," she said. "Granger." "January," she said. It was the same word she'd given Scorpius, but it meant something different in this configuration. Not "I'll be here," but "come back." Not a fixed point, but an invitation. He heard the difference. She saw him hear it. "January," he said. The word in his voice had the quality of a decision rather than a calendar entry. A commitment made in the register they had been building toward since a great hall in October, and a dungeon doorway, and a cup of Darjeeling on a windowsill in December. She looked at him. He looked at her. The snow came down around them in its patient, indifferent beauty, the flakes small and precise, settling on the dark wool of his coat, on the platform stone, on the scarlet length of the train. His hand moved. She had learned the grammar of his hands, the contained gesture, the almost motion, the careful restraint that was always evidence of something underneath it. She saw the movement begin, and she did not wait for it to complete itself and stop. She reached out and met it. Her fingers found his. Not the careful half-contact of the dungeon desk. This was deliberate. Her hand in his hand closing around hers, the full warm pressure of it, his thumb moving once across her knuckle with the particular attention of someone who has been waiting to do a precise thing and is finally doing it. She felt the warmth of it move up through her wrist and into her arm and settle somewhere central and permanent. "Thank you," he said, very quietly. The words arrived with all their weight, not for the term, not for the Tuesday afternoons, not for any single thing she could isolate and point to, but for the accumulated whole of it. for the thing she had become to both of them over 4 months of slow and careful approach. "Don't thank me," she said. "Just—" She paused, finding the honest version. "Just come back." He looked at her for a long moment. The snow was in his hair now, small, bright points of it, and the steam from the train moved around them in slow, unhurried clouds, and the platform had nearly emptied, and there was a quality to the moment she recognized from other significant moments in her life, the particular crystalline awareness of something that would not come again in exactly this form, something being lived rather than recalled. He brought his free hand up. It came to rest against the side of her face, the cold of outside and the warmth of him, the silver scratch of his ring against the line of her jaw, the careful, cupped pressure of a hand that had learned to hold things gently. He looked at her, the way he had looked at the drawing in the dungeon, with the complete attention of someone who is not cataloguing, but simply receiving, simply being present to a thing without needing to manage it. "Granger," he said, very quietly. "Yes," she said. Not to a question, there was no question, but to the moment itself, to what was about to happen, to the thing that had been accumulating since October and was finally, in the December snow of a Hogsmeade platform, arriving at its correct form. He leaned forward. She stayed very still. His mouth met hers. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of kiss that announced itself or asked for witnesses. It was quiet and warm and entirely certain. The kiss of two people who have taken a very long route to a very specific place and are not surprised to find each other there, but are, nonetheless, moved by the arrival. His hand against her jaw was steady, her hand still in his, her fingers tightening once. It lasted long enough to be real and brief enough to leave room for everything that came after. When he drew back, he was close. Close enough that she could see the snow on his eyelashes, the particular quality of his grey eyes at this proximity, the expression on his face that was the most unguarded she had ever seen, more open than the fire room, more open than the desk in the dungeon, more open than anything. He looked, for one undefended moment, like a man who had set down something very heavy and discovered that his hands knew what to do without it. From the train, a small face appeared in the window of the nearest compartment. Scorpius was watching them with an expression of such profound unsurprise that it was almost its own form of eloquence, the expression of someone who has seen this coming for a very long time and is deeply satisfied by the confirmation. He raised one hand in a small, deliberate wave, not at his father, at her. She raised her free hand back. The whistle blew. Draco turned toward the train, and she released his hand, and he stepped toward the carriage door. But he paused on the step and looked back at her one more time. Just that. One more time, with the grey eyes and the open face, and the snow still coming down around him. "January," he said. "January," she said. He boarded. The door closed behind him. The train exhaled its long breath of steam and began, with enormous slow confidence, to move. She stood on the platform and watched it go. The scarlet length of it moving away through the white air, the compartment windows passing one by one, and in one of them a small hand pressed flat against the glass, and she raised her own hand and held it there until the train curved away through the highlands and the white air closed over the space where it had been. The platform was empty. The snow came down with its patient, unhurried certainty, settling on the platform stone, on the benches, on the space where two people had stood and made an arrangement that had nothing to do with calendars. She stood in it for a moment, just stood, with the cold on her face and the warmth still in her hand where his had been, and let the fullness of the morning settle into its correct shape. Then she turned and walked back toward the castle, back through the white grounds, through the gate, through the doors that opened to receive her into the warmth and the torchlight, and the long, quiet corridors of the place that was hers, that held a classroom with a specific stool and a spare quill in a drawer, and 23 days of January waiting on the other side of the winter. She was smiling before she reached the dungeon stairs. She didn't try to stop.
This story started with a boy who didn't eat, not with a romance, not with a kiss, with a child sitting alone at the end of a long table, staring at food he couldn't touch. And I think that's why it feels real, because Hermione didn't fall for Draco. She fell for the way he lowered his son. She saw a father writing letters he was afraid to send, a man holding everything very carefully so nothing would break, and Draco didn't fall for Hermione either, not at first. He just kept finding her in doorways, in corridors, at the end of a table where his son was finally eating. That's how it happens in real life too, not in grand moments, in small ones. A cup of tea on a window sill, a drawing left where someone couldn't find it, a hand that doesn't move away. Scorpius knew before both of them. Children always do. They see what adults are too careful to admit. This story is about grief, about guilt, about two people who took the longest possible road to simplest possible thing, each other. If it made you feel something good, that was a whole point. Thank you for listening.